Welcome to the top 10 smallest towns in the state of Nebraska. This is not my favorite top 10 small towns. It's the actual smallest 10 towns in Nebraska. This is the fourth video I've done like this of different states, and it's always an interesting trip. If you're wondering why the town maybe near you isn't on this list, most likely it's because it's unincorporated. I get that question a lot in the previous videos. So these are actual towns. Every state has, a little bit different reason why they're the town, whether it's they have to have a council or mayor or different things like that. But these are actual 10 smallest towns, from the 10th smallest to the smallest in Nebraska. We start our tour here in Hendley, Nebraska, really in the southern, kind of south central part, not too far from the Kansas state line. And Hendley was started in the 1880s. It was a railroad town. Originally they wanted to call it Linden, and I don't know if the railroad decided to change the name, but they changed it to Hendley. A lot of times these towns are named after officials on the railroad. And then it grew, and into the early 1900s had over a couple hundred people, and just very slow decline over the next century, probably because of its remote location. Today, as you walk around, there are some abandoned houses. There's very little to the downtown area. Very, very pretty area. Definitely people living here, and a cool little post office / look like convenience store in the middle of town. We're in Winslow, Nebraska, and the reason it's on this list is kind of a sad one. It all started for Winslow in the early 1900s, and it grew to a typical population of over 100, like some of these other towns. And it maintained it. That was one of the differences. It actually maintained that population. And then only 3 years ago, there was a flood that hit this area, and it wiped out almost everyone. Most everyone moved away, and all that's left are a few people living here and mostly abandoned houses and businesses. There are some, historic buildings from the early 1900s, but there's just a lot. It's sad, really, walking around, because you can see there's 3 years of growth around most of the houses in terms of the weeds and things not being taken care of. So, it's got a bar right here in the middle of town called Smiley's, which is kind of ironic with a water tower in the background. That's another ironic twist. So, but yeah, very sad. There are some cool old buildings here, but mostly you're kind of overcome with, there was just 3 years ago, there was 100 people or more here, and now it's almost totally non-existent. Preston, Nebraska was established because of this railroad right here. It was 1878 when the railroad came through here, and then a couple years later, around 1881, is when it became an official town. Originally they wanted to name it Bluffton, but there was already a Bluffton, Nebraska. So there was somebody that worked here who was from Preston, England, so they ended up naming it Preston. Preston started growing in the late 1800s, and a couple hundred people, but they had issues with fires. Fires kind of took out many buildings, and an unusual weather situation. They had a cyclone that went through this part of Nebraska and also caused severe damage. So they had tough times in the first 20 or 30 years, and so it never really grew beyond what it was in those early days. And then later on, about the 1950s, the population had fallen to in the 50 or so, 40, 50 people, and kind of maintained in that area. And then in the last 20 years, it's really fallen off to where it's 19 today. As you walk around and drive around, there are some old abandoned houses, and there's not a lot of signs of old buildings from the early 1900s. So maybe I've missed them, but I haven't really seen much of that. There's a lot of information on Preston on the internet, and so in a story about a murder that happened in the 1930s, that some feuding neighbors caused obviously a lot of ruckus in a small town like this. So there's definitely some history here, and but today Preston is very quiet. Nenzel, Nebraska. I think that's how you say it, Nenzel or Nenzel. I'm going to say Nenzel. 17 people. It was started in 1899 by a George Nenzel, who was the original owner of this town site. We are pretty far out in the north, in the northern part of Nebraska. There's not many towns. It's pretty desolate and remote out here. There is the Samuel McKelvey National Forest that's just a few miles south, and just a couple miles north is South Dakota. So we're definitely out in some wide open spaces. I don't know how big Nenzel was in the early 1900s. The population numbers I have started in 1930 and got up to about 125 in 1940. That's the largest I've seen it, and then decreased all the way down to 8 in 1990, and then went up for the next couple census surveys, and then back down a few to 17. Most everything is newer. There are a few houses and buildings here, like this church that I'm sitting in front of, and so it's a nice little town and a very beautiful part of Nebraska. Sholes comes in at 16 on this list, and there's not a lot left of the old town that I can find except for the school. We'll take a peek in there real quick. It's kind of hard to get in there, but we'll show you a little bit of what's in there. But there's some newer houses, and there's not too many old abandoned places here. It was an old shipping point on the railroad. The population never really got above 100, and then has been in the 20 to 30 range for 70 years or so. So yeah, but down a long dirt road from Randolph, Nebraska. At number 5 on our list here in Brewster, Nebraska, this is definitely a kind of a special place to visit. I'm here in front of the Blaine County Courthouse, and with 12 people, that makes Brewster, Nebraska, the smallest incorporated county seat in the entire United States. There are a couple other unincorporated towns that are county seats in other places, but in terms of actual towns, this is the smallest one. And so this is what a courthouse of the smallest county seat in the whole entire United States looks like. And not only is this unique, but Brewster has a kind of a unique story as well. It was started by a man named George Washington Brewster, whose ancestors came over on the original Mayflower. And he started this settlement right in the middle of Nebraska and thought that it would become the capital of the entire state of Nebraska. It's a long way from that at this point, but he thought the centralized location would make it ideal for growth. And it did grow for a period of time. I don't know how big it was. Population figures from the late 1800s, when it was probably its biggest, are not available. But Doc Middleton, who was a famous outlaw, started a saloon here in the 1880s. There was a railroad that was talked about being a railhead here that did not happen, and so obviously it grew in its first few decades probably of existence, and then when the population figures exist in the middle 1900s, it's under 100 and has gotten really small. It's very remote out here in Blaine County, and Blaine County only has 400 plus people in the entire county, so this is not a very populated area, just full of abandoned and old buildings. And there's a few people, like I said, there's about a dozen people live here, and there's so many structures downtown as you kind of drive through. It's really remarkable. If you like ghost towns, this is definitely one that you want to check out. these next 4 towns, the last 4 towns, are all on the kind of the same road on the northern part of Nebraska. So if you're out exploring, you'll be able to see all these next 4 towns really easily in a day. Here in Burton, Nebraska, there's really all that's left are a couple of churches, and they seem to have coordinated their worship times on because I'm here on a Sunday, and one's at 9 and then one's at 11 with Sunday school in the middle for both. But that's about all that's left. The population peaked kind of in the early part of the 1900s, around 100, and then it dipped down to around between 10 and 20, and it's pretty interesting. It stayed there, and for like 60 years it's been kind of between 10 and 20, maybe dipped below or went above, and pretty remarkable when you think about it. But I don't see, like a community center or a town hall, so maybe the churches serve as that for Burton. There is a few houses kind of on one crossroad that goes across Highway 12. Anoka, with population of 10, was actually quite a bit bigger. It was over between 100 and 200 people in the early 1900s. There was a railroad that went through here. There were something like 30 buildings kind of through this area, and it's on a creek or a small river, I guess you'd call it. And I actually just met the person that lived here, and they said that when that dried up, that's when the businesses moved away and moved to Butte, which is the kind of next biggest town near here. And so then the population shrank through the middle of the 20th century, and then it's kind of held steady at around 10 for the last several decades. And there are some abandoned buildings. There are some really cool structures left here that the gentleman said hasn't been used for probably 50 years. So I got a chance to get up close and take a look at some of them.
Like I said, this is all bats leaning right here. See, that's supposed to be way up over here. That's all bats leaning that one way. So it's leaning pretty good. So
awesome.
Yeah. It's basically garage now. What it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the last time these were used were probably back in the 70s. Right here, that'd be the main street down, and that'd be this elevator right over here. If you were to take a picture of it, that was some of the businesses in town here. There's more than that, but.
when you get down to the population being so small, it's hard to know how accurate these counts are, but gross, very, very small. Second smallest officially in Nebraska, and has been small for quite a while. It has been in single digits for 50 years. But there's quite a bit to see here, believe it or not. There's an old jail. There's a community hall. There's a bar, restaurant type place. Everything. No one's here right now. It's pretty desolate feeling. And there's some playground equipment, which is unusual. So I don't see a school, but some really cool stuff to see. Obviously, the somebody or the couple people that live here take care of it, and it's kind of a neat place to visit. It used to have hundreds and hundreds of people. I read as many as 600 when it kind of first, in the first decade in the 1890s. And then the earliest official counts are in the 300s in population, and people thought there'd be a railroad coming through here. And then that didn't happen. And then a series of fires in the early 20th century, moved a lot of people out. And so it's got pretty small, and then it has remained small. But there you can see where the people live right here on Main Street, and definitely a pretty cool place to check out.
We'll see you.
Hello. Are you open? I'm at the end of a trip. I'm visiting the 10 smallest towns in Nebraska, and this is the final one. Can I ask you about the history of the town? So you're pretty famous, I hear.
Been a lot of publicity about me. I don't know if that makes me famous or not. Well, it was established along with when the railroad went through in the early 1900s, 1902 and 3. I've got pictures of, a fellow up in South Dakota whose grandfather helped build a lot of the buildings here in town, brought us a bunch of pictures here a few years ago. So in the early 1900s, and that's when the railroad went through. And so that was when it was established. And at one time, there was a bank and a high school, a couple grocery stores, filling stations, garages, just kind of normal. I think the height of its population was between 140 and 150 at the height.
And so, have you always lived here?
Yeah. My folks moved to a farm about a quarter of a mile out of town when I was about a year and a half old. So this area has always been my home. I went to school here in town, a grade school from first grade through 8th grade. And there would have been 100 or better by then, because things were going downhill already. The bank was gone, the high school was gone. It was just grade school. But I'm sure, knowing how many kids were in school up here when I was, it would have been I would say around 100 people. Mm-hmm. Big families in those days.
Yeah.
Most of them.
And then why have you stayed?
Home. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I grew up here, and then I married a guy that, well, his family moved here when he was in the 4th grade and I was in the 3rd grade, and we just always knew each other. And then after he graduated, he went in the Air Force, and I taught school 1 year, and then I went and worked for Braniff Airline for a year, and then I come back, and by then had been in about 3 years. So when he came home from overseas, then we got married, and he was at Offutt until he got discharged, but we didn't want to stay down there, so we come back up here. We farmed, and he worked construction and just various things, and we had a chance to buy the bar, but we went ahead and bought it, and I've been here ever since.
So that's the 10 smallest towns in Nebraska. And what a way to end it with Monowi, Nebraska, population 1, and Elsie Eiler telling us in her words. You probably got tired of me talking about all these towns. It's great to have someone else tell the story. So Nebraska, very interesting. A lot of, these towns have traces of their history from most of them back in the late 1800s. And so I really, really enjoyed this trip. And hopefully, maybe if you're close to some of these towns, maybe you want to stop off and check it out. Invite me in. Am I supposed to go in? I guess not.
But not that it made any difference, but it's disgusting. Now I've been getting notices about a census type thing. I just threw it away. Under penalty of law, you have to answer these. I just threw them away. You're not going to get it right anyway.